Welcome everybody to the Imperial 80s. We start in with Nick right on screen, our guest here today. Happy Halloween, everybody. We're really grateful to be here with you, and it's fun to be doing this on Halloween with a great guest, Nick Estes, who everybody knows from the Red Nation podcast, from his books and writings and edited works, as well as the Red Scare podcast. And if you're not checking it out yet, subscribe to Nick's Substack and get in with him and Cena reading Capital. Actually, Nick, maybe you could start just by saying a little bit of what you're doing with that.
Yeah, actually, the inspiration for today's film, The Blob, was Marx's Capital Volume 1. He has this term that he frequently uses in the first part of the book called the undifferentiated gelatinous blob of surplus labor. so I was like, I actually picked this film based on that. But yeah, like we're reading Capital. Cena's like a German. He speaks German. He studied the original sort of text. So we're reading Capital. We started off doing larger sections. Now we're like just doing chapter by chapter because it's so rich. And Marx is actually a Victorian horror fan also. Like there's all these mentions of like werewolves, vampires, gelatinous blobs. Like capitalism is a horror show and it hates you. And we just kind of use this text to kind of talk about those things. But also it's actually a really fun it's a fun project. It's kind of the funnest sort of podcast project that I've done in a while. So please check it out. Substack. It's like substack.com/Nick Estes, I think is where you can find it.
Yeah. I think I've been checking it out. Have it in the show description, but I'll make sure we do. Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah, me too. I mean, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I've been checking out a little bit. It's been really good, Nick. I'm on like episode two right now because I'm actually trying to read it with you. It's like cool. I've been trying to find a way to reread Capitals. I haven't done it in a while. And I've said to myself, and I was like, well, you know what? This would be the perfect opportunity to like listen to you two and then to read it with myself again.
Yeah, I said to Cena when we had him on a while ago that it's like the most fun that I've ever like seen anyone have with Capital. Like Capital can be a very dry read, I think, often for people. But you guys make it really enjoyable. So I've actually we're doing Ali Kadri's Accumulation of Waste right now. And, there's some people who are reading it who don't have much of a background in actually reading Marx, which I think is like, it's an interesting problem that I feel like we have on the left now quite often, that people are like into Marxist influenced stuff, but they actually haven't read a lot of Marx. And so there's just foundational concepts sometimes that are just weaved into everything that they don't really have a great handle on. And so I think you guys doing it the way you do is a great way to get people, into it in a fun way. So yeah, thank you for doing that series. And I definitely recommend it to folks. So the Blob. So where do we want to start? I'll just say my thing with it. So I actually didn't see this version of The Blob growing up.
Same.
And rewatched it for this. And it is interesting. Like one of the more interesting movies we've done, actually, I thought, like politically interesting in terms of like some of the, it's not like they're amazing critiques, but like, there's some interesting stuff we'll get into for sure. I watched the 58 one growing up because my father had grown up. He must have been like, 15 or something like that when that movie came out. And so it was like right with it's a kind of classic 1950s, teen horror, film, Steve McQueen's debut on a film. And that one is definitely like very much a Cold War film, which this one is as well, which I think is really interesting to talk about. But there's a lot of things that are exactly the same or very close to the same in both versions. But then there's some differences in terms of the kind of emphasis. And I think this one, the original one, I was saying to M2 before we started, like there is a read of the original that the blob represents communism, right? And so you know, it's America kind of fighting against the conformity of communism, right? In a very like anti-communist sort of way of thinking. But interestingly, because it's 58, there was also a read of it at the time that the blob represented McCarthyism,
Hmm.
and that it represented this kind of, Americana conformity that also like Hollywood had some antagonism towards at the time, because obviously a lot of actors were targeted in the Red Scares and in McCarthyism as well. And so anyway, it's just interesting to revisit this film. And also, like, I was trying to remember, how many films have we done with Kevin Dillon already? I mean, like, I didn't know that he was this popular in the 80s, like, because he was in Platoon.
Yeah.
This
What else have we did?
was he in Red Scare? I mean, not Red Scare, Red Dawn?
He's not in Red Dawn. No. I remember you said 3 in an email, and I was like, wait, there was a third, but I remember him from Platoon, and this is the first time I ever remember him starring in a movie as the de facto lead. I was
Johnny
like,
Johnny Drama.
Right, totally. Yeah, no, this is like interesting. The Kevin Dillon magnum opus performance. It's kind of interesting to kind of see, considering what he was as Bunny in Platoon, and then what he later becomes, in Entourage is like his big role, right?
Yeah.
But of course, he'll always be the shadow of his brother. But we don't have to talk about that right now.
And that's the joke in Entourage, right? Is that like his brother?
He's in the Delta Force too. I'm looking at his.
Oh yeah, maybe that's what I'm thinking.
Coming up.
Yeah, so you guys have that one coming up.
Yeah, we're gonna do that with Lara and Stephen Sheehy in a couple weeks.
I feel very bad about that, but
Oh my god, he's in a film called. Wait, we might have to do this one. He's in a film called War Party, which is set in present day Montana, exploring the tension and mistrust that can characterize interactions between Native Americans and white Americans. How did we miss this?
Whoa! I'm looking at it right now. What is this movie? Oh no! Yeah, you're right.
Wow.
Maybe he's also in The Doors, but we won't get there because it's 91. So
yeah.
All right.
Yeah. This was also a movie for me that I know I saw as a kid, but it didn't register for some reason. I didn't in my memory, and I was pleasantly surprised, but also like not surprised by some of the way the commentary was, considering like some of the time period and when it was made. And I think I'll talk about the kind of like general, I think, emotions towards the Cold War that kind of existed from a certain kind of liberal base in Hollywood. But also like like it was actually in many ways like pretty fun to watch. Like I like the gore of it, like some of it is like pretty intense. You're like, whoa, but like I can't lie, a few of those times I had the like, oh, but I was totally laughing, right? And that doesn't always happen when you watch horror films. Especially when they're done with like special effects or, these kinds of, gargantuan, very strange, renderings of a monster. Often, sometimes you just go, this looks like schlocky. But I'm watching this and I'm like, this is kind of hilarious in like the right kind of way. And also the kind of tropes that go into it. But yeah, I was totally, this is not a movie that was really on my register. And I've seen the old one and I wanted to rewatch it. But I didn't have time to do it before this, so I'm a good thing that Jay did. Nick, I'm curious, like, what was part of also the reason why you were like this film? Like, when did like you revisit it, or had you watched it younger and all that type of stuff?
I did, and I was trying to remember when I actually watched it, but I think it might have been. We used to go to like a friend's house for babysitting on the weekends when my mom would be gone and stuff, and we used to like the friend's parents would be gone too. So we would just like watch Monster Vision. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, with Joe Bob Briggs. And I think this was one of the films on there, but it didn't stick out to me because I was like really into zombies. I liked all the Night of the Living Dead movies. I liked all the George A. Romero movies. I loved Nightmare on Elm Street. I loved like Halloween. but this one didn't really stick out like for me. And I just have been kind of on this kick about like thinking about eco horror, and I would actually put this in the category of eco horror, like a progenitor of eco horror, akin to sort of Swamp Thing, but like something a little bit different, so like, yeah, rewatching this, I actually really like the special effects. I like it feels campy, even though it's a film that takes itself serious at some points, but then also doesn't take itself serious at other points. Like the part when they're in the movie theater, there's this kind of meta sort of scene when like they're watching Friday the 13th, or a knockoff version of Friday the 13th, and then they get consumed by the blob. But I also find looking at this in the context of the Imperial 80s, and thinking about the sort of the previous film in 1958, you have like Reagan, he was an actor, and he was part, I'm sure you guys covered this in some previous conversations, but
Not in much detail. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. He was like, he got his political start as somebody who, along with people like John Wayne, were essentially outing people who they felt like were sympathetic to communism in the Union. They were specifically Union members, right? I don't know if it was SAG-AFTRA or not. I could be wrong. I'm not sure. But yeah, so it's like fascinating that he's like, he's a sort of anti-communist in the acting union, and then launches his sort of political career, and then is now president in the 80s, right? And very virulent anti-communism for what he can remember. Obviously, his like brain is fried. His brain is the blob essentially by the 80s. It's mush. But I was thinking about this in 1988. I don't know how much like I felt like in the first version, it felt more Cold War-y in terms of like, yeah, there's the Soviet Union, but this is the late 80s when you're kind of seeing the beginnings of the cracks show in the Soviet Union. And I feel like it's not the enemy is not the Soviets or communism. The enemy is actually the United States government, which is very fascinating. And we can maybe get into this, where it's like it's almost this kind of inversion of like this white community, this tourist town, I think it's, what is it called, Arbinsville or something like that, is a ski community. It's an off season. This season has just ended. The ski, or no, it hasn't ended. It's the summer, and like the temperatures are getting cold, so people are like anticipating what's the new season going to be like. It seems like people are economically depressed a little bit. There's a lot of this kind of working class sort of motifs, like even people being killed on their job, like the dishwasher, he gets killed on his job. The waitress gets killed on her job. Cops don't have jobs, but they still get killed as well. And sort of the people who don't get killed are, the youth rebel, right? He's the guy who doesn't have a job. He's considered like the lumpen proletariat, right? And he has this like tenuous solidarity with the cops, and then he meets Meg, and like there's this like a class solidarity between the lumpen and this kind of like upper class white chick. Anyways, and they're this what happens to them is that they're essentially, it's a containment. It's a story of containment, right? And this idea that we have to contain this town that's been infected by this, what they think at first is a alien sort of entity, what then turns out to be a U.S. government bioweapon that's being experimented, that they're being experimented on. They're basically a sacrifice zone, right? And this is like a colonial ecology sort of narrative too, where it's like it lands in the wood, right? And then you have like the magical hobo who discovers it and like kind of sets in motion this whole like genocidal terror that it inflicts on the town. But it's also about a story about preserving sort of the purity of the white settlement, right? Because at the end of the day, it's like, we're innocent, like, oh, these boys, they're misogynist, and they're going to this film and saying all these awful things about women. They're talking about chopping up body parts, but that's just the innocence of white America, like, it's a very good film, and like kind of capturing that moment in time, because there was a lot of economic precarity. I think the 80s, everyone goes back and fantasizes about the 80s. I was born in the 80s, and I think I always thought the 80s were cool, but it was actually a really uncertain time for many communities, and I think that's kind of what it's trying to speak to. And it recuperates itself as a narrative of like the small sort of rural white town is being sort of experimented and sacrificed by the government, right? There's almost this kind of revanchist narrative in it as well, of like rural white America being subjected to this government overreach, and sort of sacrifice for the greater good of the United States. There isn't much diversity in the town. Well, at the beginning, the football game is like strangely very diverse, and then it gets less diverse in terms of characters as the movie progresses, except for the main evil villain, which is, I can't remember his name, but he's a black figure, black character, and he's like the guy who's like, we need to kill them, like they need to be sacrificed. But sorry, I just kind of jumping around a little bit, but those are sort of my initial thoughts. I have some more kind of in-depth thoughts about this notion of like ecological colonialism and things like that, because it does start in the wilderness, right? And it starts with this man who's kind of cast out of society, right? This lumpen figure, or this like the magical hobo, is cast out of society, and he discovers this meteorite, right? I think he's like smashing beer cans or something like that, and he discovers this meteorite and then becomes infected with it. And then he's the one who, when they bring him into the hospital, it's this whole scene too, again going back to this kind of like working class, these working class motifs. The first thing the nurse asks is, well, does he have Blue Cross Blue Shield? does he have health insurance? And I didn't know that was like such a thing back then either, because that's very much a thing this day and age. And so his whole infection of the entire town is actually mediated by this really hateful system of capitalism, right? How it hates even the poor whites amongst them, amongst settler society. And this leads to the horror of the hospital as well, right? They put him in this room, nobody's really checking on him. There's doctors in this office kind of like sort of being weirdly sexual with this like patient's wife or something like that. I guess he's like dying, and he's like refusing to meet the needs of this this homeless man, this white homeless man who's like been infected with this alien thing that ends up consuming half his body. But then the hospital itself becomes sort of a site of horrors, right? And there's a lot to unpack there. But I was just kind of riffing there for a second, but I can get into some more
awesome
deeper details.
And to me, do you want to do some stuff on like the Hollywood side of it?
Yeah. So the film, I think definitely want to talk about the director, Chuck Russell, who's like, he's interesting in his uninterestingness, I have to say, because he kind of mirrors, I believe, a certain kind of director that on a certain level has always existed in Hollywood, a kind of journeyman of the moment. Right, they do kind of things that are of the moment, and a lot of times they come through the genre kind of place and entry point and stay there. So this is an not his first directed film; it's his second directed film. The film he directed right before it was actually Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, which we'll do, Dream Warriors. That's actually his first directed film. He did screenwriting work before, and also was the screenwriter on Nightmare on Elm Street. The other person to kind of mention is Frank Darabont. And Frank Darabont is the co-screenwriter on this. And people might remember Frank Darabont more from when he became a director. The Shawshank Redemption, The Green Mile, early seasons of The Walking Dead. Darabont is definitely a very much working person's Hollywood individual. And, this kind of like existing through genre thing I think is interesting, and I'll get into like the film in a second, where Russell, I believe, is definitely influenced by things that came before, and I think that were kind of popular within the genre, within certain types of movies, a certain cynicism that I think was embraced in these genre films by some people that we already know, like Carpenter, who would, you know, be kind of maybe like one of the patron saints, or even Cronenberg, though he's Canadian, I think he still kind of a lot of purchase in kind of English language films. But then I think even some of the like the lesser known films like Society, which is something that we have to do, the kind of more underground horror films about, you know, that there's a deep state, there's like a duality kind of culture within America that's really the problem, and kind of touches on what Nick was saying, that, you know, America does have a salt of the earth goodness, right, to it. The settler, right, the colonialist, this project does have a fundamental goodness to it, but there's this nefarious other side. And various people take it. Some do it as like secret societies that gets very popular in films, things like Society, right? Some do it like deep state. Jay and I were talking about this kind of deep state that exists. And it also exists somewhat in like action movies of the period. We're going to get to Die Hard next month, the kind of cynicism of like the FBI is willing to sacrifice everybody at Nakatomi Plaza. Things like Blue Thunder that would come out. So there's like this general late 80s cynicism. And if I'm drawing from my own experience, I think some of it also has to do with, if we're in 88, there is a bit of an exhaustion with the Cold War. There's like a Cold War exhaustion that I think exists with a certain part of American society. You had things like Star Wars, Reagan, the economic precarity that's in there. So it's not necessarily like these horror people are like, you know, background you know, communists like they were in like the 50s, like they really were actually communists and Marxists in Hollywood at the time. But they definitely were part of that liberal, they don't like Reagan, they don't like the conservative bent, and they want to kind of have this, you know, attitude towards it, this kind of punkish attitude towards it, saying, you know, you're fucking up this dream, you know, of, you know, and essentially all the figures have a good to them. The petty bourgeois white girl can, you know, she has a good thing to her. We know she's a little annoying, but guess what? The Molly Ringwald is actually fundamentally really strong. And I say Molly Ringwald not as her, but Molly Ringwald as like a kind of trope that existed, right? And I think she would accept that too, because she realized she became a kind of trope, right? Or you know, the biker jacket kid, right? You know, played by Kevin Dillon, or even the football kid who dies earlier, right? He's, you know, well, though the other football kid is a complete jerk, but we also, the way even how that's framed is interesting. So Russell and Darabont, you know, they kind of set their feet into, I think, this thing, which is a kind of consistent narrative, especially by this point in the kind of like world of this kind of genre movie making. I think it's really highlighted by like a high cynicism towards the kind of malfeasance that exists, but also a kind of, not all of them, somewhat of a, I don't want to say appreciate. Well, this film I would say has they do believe in the project based on the people and these like individuals who have like a great potentials, and we get to see their potentiality arrived in defeating this monster. Though there's interesting critiques around various kind of people. The producers are interesting. They're not people that you would know as much as they've done a lot of films. You know, I think one of the things that could be like a side project, if anyone wanted to ever do it, and like shout out to us, it'd be great, is it's just where capital kind of lies in entertainment. You know, there's just like these interesting figures. They do movies throughout the decades, right? And you don't really know who they are, but you realize they just have tons of money. And then you look at like they're part of like these different businesses. And I'm sure there's interesting individuals in ways that like I couldn't find in simple Google searches, but like because like, you know, they have a Wikipedia page and they have all this stuff that they've done, but like they're not people that you know. And also like it's so chaotic. Like one of the producers, he, you know, produced Robert Altman's The Long Goodbye, and that's like super, you know, different from this film in like the 70s. One interesting thing about Chuck Russell is that later though he's in like he's trying to do like film token blockchain movies, right? So this is kind of what I'm talking about with these like journeyman directors. They kind of all like kind of this latch on to like whatever trend, that kind of exists. And Russell definitely is one of those kinds of people. He would later do things like Eraser with Schwarzenegger. He did The Mask. It might be his most well-known movie, maybe. I don't know. I don't know. I hate that movie so much.
That's
I
a
think people
terrible
love
movie.
it.
Eraser, Eraser. I remember liking, actually, although it probably is messed
But
up. But
that's also the movie that's like considered somewhat of like the beginning of the downslope of Arnold's career, like, or like one of the downslope movies. Eraser is considered, and it's interesting that he would, that would be one of his films, Yeah, but yeah, I mean, there's other things I think to say in
I'm not
terms
sure
of
there
like
was an
the narrative.
upslope to. I'm not sure there was an upslope to Arnold's career, but
No,
he was
no.
putting a lot of things.
No. But like where he was at the peak of his like even box office powers, I think Eraser was like I went and saw the premiere of Eraser, actually, believe it or not. And Arnold was there. It's a very whole other story years ago with my dad. And yeah, Vanessa Williams was there, who my dad had a huge crush on. So I think he was just sitting in there going like, I've seen God, I've seen the goddess, and it's Vanessa Williams, Eraser, yes. But I remember that I was like 16 or something like that. But yeah, I think we can start digging in, I think, to the movie. I don't know if there's anything else from like the previous film that you wanted to attach, Jay, or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could say a little bit about the relationship between the two films, because like actually this film borrows very heavily on the first film. I mean, it's a remake, obviously, right? And that's often what remakes do. But sometimes in a remake they will kind of shift, certain things. And in this one, they actually take a majority of the the scenes, the spots of horror, I guess you could say, right, are just straight up lifted, as well as the dynamics of the blob itself, right? So the idea that it's cold that actually stops the blob, right? Fire doesn't hurt it, guns and things like that don't hurt it, right? Brute force, etc. Like, and in both movies they figure that out oddly through a fire extinguisher, but even though in both cases they also had a previous scene where they were in like a walk-in, freezer basically, and the blob couldn't go in there and retreats. So that scene is in both. The scene where like there's a movie theater, scene in both. There's a diner scene in both. Convenience stores, I think, in both. So like a lot of these spaces, follow through in both films. The originals, I mean, talk about special effects. The original is really funny to watch because it it was always a joke, and they do kind of play on that in this movie. The joke at the original was that they used strawberry jam for the blob because that's what it looks like. But actually, I read that's not true. They use like silicone and like some coloring stuff or whatever. But it really does look like strawberry jam in the original, like somebody just like squeezing it out of like you know a bottle or whatever into vents and stuff like that. But in both cases, you get these like the use of real effects to some degree, which again is this is like a big 80s thing that we've seen in a lot of movies now, because the digital effects are not to the way that they have very limited stuff that they could do digitally in that era. So you used real effects, and yeah, I mean, I think it works well. Like, I think the blob looks like in both movies, even in the 58 one, it looks like a real thing. Um and I'm trying to think of other things. I mean, there's also in both the 58 and the 88 one, right? Which is the one we watched. It's the teenage stuff, right? Which is this is like huge in horror genre in general, right? Of like, oh, trying to have sex, like buying condoms, the kind of I don't think it was that. I kind of quickly watched the 58, so I don't think there was anything that explicit, of course, in the 50s, right? Because it would have been much more kind of, toned down. But, young kids going out to parties, going out on dates, going out to the hill, right, to like make out, like these kind of things are there in the original as well. And so there's many ways in which it's quite a direct remake, and really the shift is sort of in what the Blob is, right, and in maybe what it represents, is a little bit different in the two films, with like Nick saying this one is more of actually um a critique. And I would also say, like, the point that Nick made about the hospital, I do think in this film there's a number of points at which they're quite clear in sort of like, yeah, like, you don't have health insurance, like, well, we're not going to see you, like, there's kind of like, if not a critique of capitalism, certainly a critique of like, um like, uh forms of exploitation, right, and kind of corporate uh practices within things that should be for the greater good, right? And so maybe, I mean, this is one of the things we've talked about explicitly too, and you mentioned Reagan, Nick, is that obviously in the 80s there is a lot of kind of anti-Reagan sentiment, particularly from liberals, that goes into kind of a classical liberal, mindset of, well, we should care for people a little bit. We should have some health care. We should have social security, like that this fear of neoliberalism kind of stripping away, all of these things that were part of the social safety net for a lot of years. Right. And, so, yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what to me makes the second one, or this one that we watched, kind of really interesting, is that I think the critiques in it are, for the most part, left of what they're critiquing, right? Like, whatever, it's critiquing stuff that is, right wing. It's critiquing the US government, really, in its kind of um no holds barred, or no consideration of the costs of this kind of Cold War anti-communism, and kind of the monsters that it creates or comes up with, in order to defeat this enemy, which, as you said, Nick, like, the Soviet Union's not present in the film. Like, the only thing is sort of this, from the state actors, particularly the guy you talked about. We should pull up his name. The black actor who plays like the head of the,
Seneca.
you
That's
know,
Joe Seneca.
Joe Seneca, right? And his name in the
Joe,
film is Meadows, right? Dr. Meadows. Yeah. And so Dr. Meadows represents like the hardcore, like, it doesn't matter if we sacrifice Americans, if we can build the bioweapon that has the capability of defeating communism across the globe, then like it's worth it, and we can sacrifice, even entire nations in that pursuit, basically, is kind of the way that he articulates that. So yeah, I'll stop there, but we
yeah,
can jump into
can't give him
different parts
health
of the
care,
film.
but we can give him bioweapons.
Yeah.
Right.
I want to point out a little bit too about so this is a resort town, and the opening scene like kind of begins, it's kind of doing like two things. One is kind of showing how this is a ski town, so it depends on a seasonal economy. I don't know if I grew up in a town that was sort of a resort town, and the summers were really busy, and then the winters, everyone kind of went away. But there's a service economy that was really dependent on, or served this, these outsiders who would come in. And I just thought it was fascinating because skiing, it's not considered like a working class sport. It's like very much catering to upper class, folks, the ruling class, or upper middle class, whatever. And it doesn't seem like the townspeople themselves are avid skiers, right? They're playing football, right? The guy literally gets a concussion at the beginning of the film. Like, it was like TBI. There we go. And so I was thinking about that. Then also there's this sort of decay that's happening, right? We have this like halcyon days, right? The make, like when Trump is saying like things like "Make America Great Again," he's talking about the 1950s. He's talking about the gains of labor unions, the social democracy of, you know, FDR, but obviously it's all kind of stripped away and kind of just, you know, it's really what he's saying is like these, you know, these all white settlements, right? And these all white communities. And so there's kind of this decay element that's happening as well. And so this town is really subject to the whims of outsiders, right? And their economy, and there's kind of discussion, you know, will there be, you know, the ski season, will this be the one, you know, will this be the year that like really saves us? And it's ironic that like it's the ski economy, the ski technology, the snow machine, right? That like defeats the blob. But it's also this notion of like these outside forces are controlling the lives of these, you know, these innocent sort of white settlers who are really being disserviced by this American dream that they all have, right? So I think that's kind of an element that I wanted to kind of play up a little bit, because these are not really even the like the houses of them, you know, or we go into the house of the like the white family, and they have all these things, you know, they have like, I just noticed like all the stuff that they had. And then you have the kid who's like working at the mechanic shop, right? He just doesn't have anything, right? He lacks material wealth. But I felt like that was a really kind of strong through line through this whole thing. And there's this kind of looming sense of like uncertainty about what the future of this town is, which is really sort of put into crisis when what they think is an alien at first, right, that begins to terrorize people in the town. And I just thought that was a good sort of play on things. And I really like the special effects. I like the color of, it's like one of my favorite hues, I guess, of things. They're like turning like it's like a purple red or something like that. I thought that was really effective. I thought the use or the weaponization of certain things, like you know, there's I was a dishwasher once, and we did have clogs. So every time and like every horror movie, somebody sticks their hand down a drain, you know, and there's like either a garbage disposal, you know, or in this case, it's the blob literally coming up and grabbing this person. But yeah, I also like how the blob itself sort of accumulates all these bodies, right? And it's undifferentiated. It doesn't care. It eats the children. It eats, you know, it eats the cops. It eats the worker. Everyone is sort of amassed into this ever expanding blob, and it almost is like a sort of a repressed sort of notion of the sort of repressed sort of settler colonialism, right? Settler colonialism is the blob. It has consumed the continent, right? The bioweapon has already been exploded, so to speak, right? It annihilated. There's no reference to indigeneity. It's just this whole land has been cleared and emptied of meaning and recast as sort of the enjoyment of, you know, basically rich people at the expense of poor whites. But this blob is sort of an inversion of that narrative. Now, this decaying town, once the promises of, you know, upward mobility are, you know, there's the economic sort of pressure, the crisis that's looming overhead. But then, you know, this blob comes in, and it's like, now we are the Indians. Now we are the natives, right? We are the ones who are being put on reservations. The government has, you know, come in and done a secret bioweapon experiment on us and is not letting us leave, you know, and it's taking our children, it's disappearing our children, it's disappearing our police officers, it's throwing the town into chaos, right? There's this sort of looming sense of collapse, right? As the story progresses, right? The innocence, all the innocence that was once in, you know, present is now lost, right? And I liked how you Matume said that these are all these characters are made to be sort of likable, right? And you know, they're just like, oh gee, you know, even the magic hobo is, you know, made to seem like likable. And the only person who has sort of sympathy for everyone is the person who's cast outside of it, and that's the, you know, the youth rebel, and he becomes, he becomes the hero, you know, at the end of the day. He's the only one, because he's so far outside of society, who can see the danger, who can see, you know, he tries to escape the reservation, right? And they're like, shoot him, shoot him, shoot him. So like this notion of off the reservation, right? It's a common sort of political term. When somebody goes off the reservation, that actually harkens back to colonial times, when if a native person did leave the reservation, right, they would be summarily like shot, executed, or punished, you know, for something. So that was sort of an ongoing theme with this particular film. And I don't want to like jump to the end, but I think there's this idea that, like, if you look at it from a Marxist perspective, right, and there's this struggle, like, okay, so this youth, this rebellious youth, makes all these class alliances. He aligns with the cops, he aligns with, you know, the middle class, the liberals, right, to defeat this blob. That's the only way they can defeat and stop the destruction of their town. But still, like, they haven't, the looming question is like, well, the government was never held accountable, right? They literally committed genocide against you, and like for all we know, they just kind of walked away from it and nothing happened, right? And so the end is the preacher, who kind of plays a role throughout, right? He's the one who's going to unleash, like, since you know, capitalism wasn't defeated, since settler colonialism wasn't defeated, and it was just left, it was put into literally a glass container. It still has the potency to one day, you know, once again unleash this sort of genocidal terror on, you know, on the rest of the town. And I also want to just kind of make a comment too. I think you put this in the episode description, but you call this the shapeless terror. There are many shapeless terrors. I think Halloween, my favorite film ever. You know, Michael Myers is the shape, right? That's it. If you look at the credits, his character is actually just called the Shape. In the script, he's written as the Shape. He doesn't speak. He doesn't do anything other than just kill, right? And that's essentially what the Blob does. So you can project just about anything you want onto that, but really, I would say this shapeless terror is a mirror. It's a mirror to settler colonial society. It's a mirror to genocidal capitalism. It's a mirror to sort of the ecological collapse that's going on all around them. And it's sort of a subverted subconscious that's, like, you know, making itself known in this film in a very violent form, you know, towards the characters, but also to the audience too. And what should be recognizable as like the imminent threat of ecological collapse, perhaps nuclear annihilation, is not. It's just made into sort of a cheap form of horror that is, you know, terrifying. It's taking what we actually do find very troubling, very nightmarish about the system, about the government secrets, and turning it into a form of entertainment, which that's kind of why I like horror in general, right? I think now we have the new genre is called new horror. I think, I could be wrong, and Matumi, correct me if I'm wrong. I think they call it new horror. It's like elevated horror. It's like a award or a Academy Awards level horror, right?
Grief
really
horror is a big one.
What is it?
Grief horror is another one.
Yeah,
horror is constantly subgenre now. I think it's kind of annoying personally, but
yeah, and it's become elevated. And at this time, you know, it was still kind of seen as like, you know, cheap, campy, very working class, lowbrow. You know, I was reading the reviews of it. You know, like people just like trashed it. It was like, you know, just like this misogynistic, you know, blah 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 blah. But the tropes actually do remain, I think, in even new horror, elevated horror. It's just repackaged, right, to say that it's more sophisticated, but in reality it's not. It's still kind of playing on those fears, right, that people have, and turning them into forms of entertainment.
It's interesting that they would call it misogynistic too, because I actually think that, like, there's criticism of the teen men, you know, in the film. I mean, there's a great scene, right, where and it's not great because of what the guy's trying to do, but it's great because of what happens to him. But you know, this guy's like on a date, right, with this girl, and he has a full fucking bar in his trunk of his car, right? Like he's back there like mixing
with the
drinks.
trophies of the women that he's been able to get too, which
I
to
didn't
me
even.
implies, because
Yeah.
she has like a class ring. So
Yeah.
to me, it
Yeah.
was
Yeah. Yeah.
implying that this
Okay.
is like a ritual that he does, and the only thing that I could get is sexual assault personally. Like it wasn't like,
Totally. Totally. No, I mean, like I didn't see them actually sit, but like my kind of assumption is like I mean, for one, like he's clearly looking date rape here, right? Like he's clearly trying to get this girl like so drunk that she can't fight back, basically, right? But possibly Spanish fly or other things like this, right? Who knows? But he's back there and he's got this just whole setup in his trunk, which is like just, I mean, insane and ridiculous. But then he comes back into the car and she's already like passed out. And of course, he uses this moment to assault her, right? Knowing that she's unconscious, basically. And he reaches into her like bra, basically, and the blob has already consumed her. And so it grabs him and like then she starts to like implode basically, and it's like horrifying, and then of course the thing eats him and like you know consumes basically the whole car, as well. But like a scene like that, right? Like you're not, sometimes there is actually, I mean, one, that sort of date rape culture is like very big in the 80s and 90s, right? Like we all grew up with a lot of that within film and music and everything else, like being, kind of promoted really as like a cultural thing. This film actually, I think, is like very clearly like saying like, hey, you act this way, you're gonna fucking get killed by the blob, like stop doing it. So it's interesting that way. I think, I don't know that I would read it as a particularly misogynist film, not that it isn't, but like that compared
Well,
to its peers. Go
I'm
ahead.
not saying, I mean, I think I think it's like that sort of inherent in the like the horror genre at the time. I'm not making that. I was just saying I read those things, but I would also say that don't you find it interesting that the pharmacist who sold the condoms to this individual is under the impression that this is going to happen to his daughter, right? And the guy who shows up at his house to take his daughter on the date is the guy he thinks is going to like basically date rape his daughter, but then he's just like, whatever, man, like it's the 80s. He's just like, let's do this.
Yeah,
I'm messing up here.
yeah, and just to clarify, I wasn't saying you were saying that, but I just thought it was interesting that that would be a thing that the critics would home in on with this film, because I actually think, I mean, we've talked about this. There's so many bad films in the 80s. Like it is not it is not an era of like really great, not that there's like a wonderful era of Hollywood. I mean, it's like, you know, making imperialist propaganda is kind of its role within our society in general. But, coming out of the 70s, I think there's a lot more interesting stuff happening in films in the 1970s in terms of kind of the art of filmmaking and so on. And I don't think of the 80s as a particularly artistic era, but I actually think this film is way more interesting than a lot of its peers at the time in terms of some of the, like what you just laid out, Nick. I think there's a lot that you can do with this film, to think about, okay, what does the blob represent, like, and even what some of the critiques that they're making within the film with it.
Yeah, one of the interesting the things the film does, and this is where I sometimes think directors like to take little shots at each other, because like that, there's a sequence where you almost think they're about to do the typical trope. You see a young dude and a woman, and you think you're about to get the kind of Jason Voorhees sequence where in the film, and you're like, I haven't seen these characters before. Are you just going to add two new people to kind of get blobbed, right? And one of the things about those Friday the 13th films is this really harsh negativity towards teenage sex, right? And kind of like showing that like teens are like sex crazed, and and it's their sex crazed depravity that's basically going to get them into trouble. It's very puritanical, right? And you're thinking this movie's about to go there, and you're kind of like, oh man, you really about to go there? And then they flip it that they're actually watching that movie, right? And they have the guy with the hockey mask and the whole thing, right? And then when you put it against some of the previous scenes of like the Blob getting this date rapist, and so forth and so on, you begin to realize, oh, this is probably these people taking little shots at their like fellow genre makers, and it becomes this kind of tit for tat wars that I'm sure existed at the time between people within the genre who recognized those things, who thought they were silly, where they were being super principled. Maybe they thought they were going to take a piss out of each other. We don't know. We can't judge intention, but when I watched it, I was like, oh yeah, this is interesting. And I think it goes back, I think, to another kind of thing that I said, and it kind of touches on Nick, because one of the things about Hollywood in the 70s is they were very interested in like two places. They were really interested in the cities, right? And the extreme rural, like the people who were like the degraded ones, things like Five Easy Pieces, or the Last Picture Show, like the dying town that's about to go away, or the cities, like the crazy cities, Taxi Driver, so forth and so on. Yeah, you had towns and suburb films in the 70s, but they weren't that big. The 80s really became obsessed in varying degrees with like the suburbs and or towns, right? And the kind of multiplicity with it. You see it everything from the teen dramas, like the Breakfast Clubs, the Pretty in Pinks, the what is it? Not saying anything. Maybe say anything also, but I was thinking of the other one.
Same.
Exactly. They all kind of glup in my brain. A lot of these movies,
Yeah.
right?
I was saying to you, I was like, we have to do Say Anything, and you were like, oh yeah, we do need to do a John Hughes film. I was like, no, that's
No,
Cameron
that's not
Crowe.
it's
It's like it
Cameron
all
Crowe.
bleeds.
It all blends, right? But then also the horror films take place mostly in towns and suburbs, right? It's like where they kind of live. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with the kind of refocus of like, what is the salt of the earth? Who are the people that we're going to emphasize with? I mean, think about Red Dawn also, right? The film isn't positioned for us to go watch like the Soviets and the Cubans take over New York City. They take over this like salt of the earth area, right? Of the settler colonial project, right? And to kind of show the goodness and the good spirit. And I find that fascinating because, this is who they see as the real victims of everything. And that's what when I watch it, I go, well, that's so interesting, that where they've kind of refocused their kind of idea of who are the people who are truly suffering in all this, right? And it's such a thing that I think is so deeply characteristic of the 80s, right? That where they would reframe their focus of this blob being state made and part of some kind of deep state project, that the place that it would eventually take over the most is this town, and the people who will also be most equipped to defend it will be these townspeople, and the kind of like class unity, as Nick pointed out, that they would kind of have to make. But it's interesting because it's still based on a kind of like fundamental individualism as well, right? Because they have to be these like specially arrived individuals, right? They have to, the character played by Shawnee, is it Shawnee Smith? What's her last name? Shawnee Smith, yeah, Meg, right? You literally get to see the petit bourgeois, become like this, like raw. I mean, she has her Red Dawn moment when she's up there with the gun on top. I was like, oh man, they could have like took her out. She could have been a Wolverine, bro. Like she was like, you motherfucker. She's like nasty. Got the gat out. Like she just looks like so arrived in her like total like warrior vulgarity. And it's when you think of like Imperial 80s, it's like American kind of envisioning can't go past this like kind of thing of like, yes, good Americanness, but if they gotta arrive and get that kind of guttural, roughness, they can, right? And that the gun, right? So it still becomes like the frontier for me. I'm still seeing the revolution. I'm still seeing all those types of things that defend your home type vibe that exists within their kind of mentality. And it's really fascinating to watch because it's a political unconscious. When I watch it, I realize like I don't think a lot of times they realize they're doing these things. It's like this part of their political unconscious. Like they could see part of like what's really fucked up, but then their expression of that unconscious comes out so strangely all the time.
Yeah, just quickly a couple things. So I did find it also interesting that Flag, who's played by Kevin Dillon, is like kind of the hero in the film, right? And he has like sort of this classical greaser trope, which is like based on racists, like anti-Mexican primarily, kind of propaganda, um, but really gets kind of shifted in the 70s and 80s, right, to include like sort of the white, like nonconformist, the kid in high school who gets in trouble all the time with the cops and is failing out of his classes, right? The police department knows well, like is like, hey, you're about to turn 18, right? You get in trouble again, like you're going to jail. It's not juvie this time. um and he's the sort of hero of the story. The other thing that is interesting is, just to say in passing, so Meg, Shawnee Smith, I looked this up too because I was like, is she like indigenous or a pretendian? But I guess her parents just named her Shawnee. But she become people would know her. She's not in a lot of things that people would know that well, but she becomes Amanda in the Saw series and does like the whole run of those movies. And so that's like actually where people would know her most is from the Saw series. So she later on has a really like significant career through that horror series, which is just interesting.
Also, I remember her as one of the like army brat people in Iron Eagle, which we also have to do. She's
There you
one of
go.
the like people who help Lou Gossett Jr. arm to go out and make the fake Saddam Hussein pay for torturing our great American soldiers. I'm totally gonna get clipped on that one.
It's fascinating too, like all the there's at the beginning of the film, nobody believes the kids, like they're running around, they're like, we're being invaded by aliens. Everyone's like, stupid kids, like this isn't happening. And then later on, the people with guns can't stop this thing, right? And it is like a very sort of a Red Dawnish sort of outcome, in the sense that they become the saviors. Like they're better at like doing military stuff than the actual military. Like all the military people do, they just die. Like they get
Yeah.
consumed by the blob.
That point you're making too was from the original Blob too, which I think is an interesting, kind of dynamic in the film of the kids and like nobody's. But M2 has talked about this before. Maybe you'll have some thoughts when he hops back on. But like, nobody believes the kids, right? And this is but you should believe the kids. Like it's sort of that like listen to your children, kind of theme. But yeah, there's definitely, again, which is something we saw it in Nightmare on Elm Street as well. Like this critique of cops is just this like totally inept, incapable of dealing with this at all. And really all the adults, like they don't know, it's the kids who figure out how do we defeat this thing. And
Yeah. It's a very funny sort of trope that happens. And at the end too, it's like the scene of like the fully emancipated white woman like shooting. Like this is a funny thing, she's just like da, 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 da. Yeah, that was it. That was such a great scene. I really liked a lot of it. I think I wanted to kind of like take apart some of these, like this idea of like how the blob maybe represents certain things like capitalism, like like ecology, or even like settler colonialism. I think there's also this idea too, with the preacher who kind of represents the sort of morality, in the film. It's like, oh, these kids shouldn't be, he's at the football game, he's at the pharmacy, and then at the end he's kind of like converted to be an apocalyptic kind of figure, right? He's like giving a sermon in a tent, in a revival tent, right? But it's also this notion of like, even though all these things have been resolved, the blob has been defeated, there is no terror, there is no more danger, that sense of security also betrays you. And actually those feelings that you may have of security actually like hate you, because there is no resolution, right? There's no resolution. The enemy hasn't been defeated. And I feel that's sort of a kind of telegraphing later, like what we have is like, what other scholars may have called like effective capitalism, right? This notion that you can sort of buy your feelings, right? There will be some resolve if you purchase or consume certain things, or believe in certain narratives, right? And it also lends itself to the sort of inevitability of capitalism to, it may seem to like the more violent forms that exist kind of may seem to like go away for a bit, but they will return. And I think the preacher is kind of a fascinating figure because he becomes disfigured in the process. He like runs towards the blob as some sort of messianic sort of figure, becomes disfigured by it, much like many workers become disfigured by capitalism in their jobs. Many of the workers in this film get like mutilated like horribly, but yet it's like also sort of an ideology and an affect, meaning that they will still defend it and promote it too, and unleash its horrors upon the world, if they find it necessary to do so, to fulfill some sort of in his kind of thinking, sort of eschatology, end of the world sort of thing. But it's also this notion, like, I think this is kind of where, I don't know if this happened in the original one, but it's also kind of where I think like the Soviet Union becomes less and less of a sort of like threat, and it's more so like, since there is no sort of global superpower, the United States is like looking for the next enemy, right? And it's the blob. The blob is like this kind of fungible thing where it can become whatever you want. It turns to terrorism in the 90s. It turns to eco terrorists, in the 90s as well. It's kind of looking for the new enemy of empire, right? And I feel like that's kind of a telegraphing. It couldn't obviously predict what happened, after 1988, but I feel like it's sort of a telegraphing of like, and the United States possesses this weapon, right? And now it's like looking like who's it going to use this new technology on? It used it against its own civilians, and it's almost kind of the opposite of it might be the Imperial boomerang, but it's like using its own population for testing grounds to unleash the horrors of this sort of new technology. I'll say a little bit about some other things too, like the ecology aspect, right? This like, if even the way that the blob looks, it kind of resembles maybe like environmental pollution, right? It looks kind of has this kind of viscous nature, kind of like perhaps like an oil spill, right? You had Exxon Valdez around this time, right? And this in it itself is kind of a blob that spreads out all over the coastline and sort of consumes life, right? But it's also, this idea of like weaponizing nature, because the blob doesn't really do anything. It needs things to eat. It needs things to consume, to grow and to expand. But it's also sort of a way that makes us like also question nature itself, right? But we find out it's a bioweapon. It's a human-made sort of technology, but nonetheless, I still think it originates in the woods, right? And then sort of finds its way into the town, and sort of insinuates itself into people's lives, breaking down the barriers that we've set up for ourselves, right? Between home, between work, between, the hospital. It seeps into all those things, right? And it's like, in some ways, it's kind of like also representing this kind of broader form of what capital actually is, because there is no clear separation, from the social reproduction that happens in the domestic sphere, right? You could even call the woods, right? People are out there, like, what is the main character doing, in the woods? He's just trying to have fun, or I don't know, he's trying to be Evel Knievel and jump and do this like motorcycle jump, but he's out there kind of blowing off steam. What are the kids doing in the woods? They're like out there for entertainment, they're out there for like to relax, because nature is kind of seen as a place where one sort of releases the tensions that they have in their lives, and to try to sort of overcome some of these feelings, but then that becomes weaponized against them, right, as well. And slowly that sort of it seeps its way into how how these various kind of aspects, the home, the workplace, the diner, eventually kind of consuming the entire town, and showing in many ways that yes, capitalism is sort of this giant gelatinous blob of undifferentiated labor, as Marx says, but value isn't just produced in the side of the workplace, right? The worker has to go home and has to recharge themselves. They have to go into nature, and now all of these things become sort of forms of danger, things that hate you. Nature hates you now, your feelings hate you. Like, there's no sense of resolve. Your home hates you, and your job hates you, right? So I think your family hates you as well, right? They're also turned into this blob that now is consuming you. So I think that was kind of what I was thinking about, and sort of like what it represents in all these kind of various spheres, and how it's sort of breaking down the boundaries of what we see as sort of discrete boundaries of class, of like workplace, of home, of sites of reproduction, sites of entertainment. It goes into the movie theater and consumes everybody there, right? Who are all there having cheap thrills. So yeah, I was just kind of riffing on some of that stuff.
No, awesome, Nick. I mean, so I wanted to read this one section of the film. So this is Dr. Meadows, right? Who we've already talked about a couple of times. He's, to be clear about what this group is, right? Is like eventually this they're called like a biocontainment group comes in, right? They're there, Nick talked about like people being put on reservations, right? Like people are being quarantined, right? So this is the thing. And then they're they're initially sort of like, oh, we're just, government workers here to contain this, this germ, right? That has come from space. Like, it's sort of the way that they present themselves, right? But Brian Flagg, who's Kevin Dillon's character again, he is in the woods and is like hiding kind of, and overhears them. And so this is like, as there's a couple of like kind of a debate between Meadows and some of the other guys on his unit, right, about what to do. And so I'm just going to read a little bit of Meadows' speech here. So actually, I'm gonna do a little bit of the back and forth here. So it starts with Jennings, who's like the white guy on the unit, who's like sort of the disagreeing. This is the tension within the biocontainment field. So Jennings says, "Sir, the organism is growing at a geometric rate. By all accounts, it's at least 1,000 times its original mass." Meadows, "This will put U.S. defense years ahead of the Russians." Jennings, "You don't understand. At this rate, by next week, there may be no US. Meadows, "Nonsense. All we have to do is contain it properly. As far as the locals are concerned, this is simply a medical quarantine. Nobody gets in or out." End quote. Jennings, Dr. Meadows, "For the record, I don't agree with any of this. Those people's lives are at stake." So then this is Meadows's like kind of speech here. He says, "Don't you think I know that? This isn't one of your textbook exercises, Mr. Jennings. This is an experiment in biological warfare. Or hadn't you noticed? That organism is potentially the greatest breakthrough in weapons research since man split the atom. What do we have? What we do have. Wait, sorry. What we do here will affect the balance of world power. Of course, there are lives at stake. Whole nations, in fact, and that's more whole nations, in fact, and that's more important than a handful of people in this small town. And that is my cross to bear, Mr. Jennings." and then from there you kind of learn that the Blob, goes into the sewers, and that Meg and her little brother and his friend are in the sewers with it, and they're trying to escape it. And there's basically a decision made that, like, as Meadow says, that they're expendable, right? And that, we contain the Blob in the sewers, and we'll figure out how to, you know whatever, bottle it up, right, and use it as this bioweapon. And we're fine to sacrifice the humans, however many we need to, in this small town, in order to have this successful biological warfare experiment. And what they had said that they had done is, like, created a virus and sent it into space, and then sending it into space, they believed would do something to it, and it did do something to it to make it this really intense biological weapon. So that's the kind of the plot, and where we get into, obviously, the critiques that the film is making, really about, US Cold War kind of, chase every weapon at all costs, policy, which obviously, as they reference right there, right, it gives us the nuclear bomb as well, right? It I mean, in some sense, that comes in the race with the Nazis, of course, but right, the threat that they could use it again in this period is definitely against, the Soviet Union, right? And that is the big, nuclear fear in this era, is that there will be a nuclear war between the US and the USSR. So anyway, I just wanted to add that little bit of context.
It's
Yeah, I
also
think
like the militarization of space. Like you have the Star Wars Defense
Mhm.
Initiative in the 80s, and this kind of like fear that like now we're putting things out into space, and space becomes, this military technology like descends from the skies and brings sort of militarism back to the planet. Yeah, thanks for that summary,
yeah,
Jared.
yeah, I think that's really important because I mean that also becomes within the kind of sci-fi genre a kind of dominant, you know, in film, a dominant kind of position. It's like this kind of like corporatism or deep state activity sees everyone as expendable. I mean, think about Alien, right? What's the thing that happens when they go to Mother, and Mother basically says that you're expendable, right? I always find that funny when Yaphet Kotto basically is like, look, I'll go out there if you give me my shares, right? And they're like, yeah, you'll get your shares. So this kind of like worker thing, but Yaphet doesn't know that he's actually being super exploited to the point of possibly being wasted, right? Kind of like an Ali Kadri kind of way. He is wasted in that kind of way. Like you have to contain this alien for us, right? So we can then work on it later, which then happens in the sequel when Burke basically sends them back there, right? And then they, to kind of get the alien, knowing that it'll probably impregnate them and all this type of stuff. This kind of corporatism that is super nefarious, and it just has this way that it wants to contain this kind of biological object that has like a next evolutionary potential also. They're kind of into this idea of like the next evolutionary potential. Some films do that a little bit more, right? I think Alien is more like, this is more, I think, in the kind of weaponry kind of vibe. But I think because it is organic fundamentally, I think it's like implicit, this kind of evolutionary potential of this kind of blob that they've been working on. It has like a next stage that they can access. I also think a thing that they're playing with here is definitely on like nuclear fallout fear. Because I think, by 88, I know me. When I was 6 years old, I had nuclear nightmares. Like I actually had nuclear war nightmares that things would fall apart. I remember when like the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up. I couldn't sleep for like 3-4 days. These kinds of distrust of science, also that science has become fundamentally corrupted. You can't trust it anymore, which I find then The Preacher really interesting because almost that we need to kind of go back to a kind of spiritualist pre-enlightenment stage to kind of wrestle with what's coming, or not even we need, but we're going to. Maybe that's what it is. Not making a judgment, but saying that's what's going to be the next thing. We're going to hit this kind of apocalyptic next phase, and you're going to have to deal with this on a somewhat religious ground, because this is what it is. It's the whole thing of science And if you think about the Cold War as a science race also between the Soviet Union and the US, it's interesting then that by the end of this film, the religion becomes the kind of dominant thing that he wants you to kind of leave off with, that this is going to go beyond that, that science is capable of creating monstrous things, but it's incapable of, dealing with this on a grand level, which I think is, something definitely that comes out of, Western kind of thinking. The Star Wars thing was big on my brain too. Like when it came out the sky, I was like, oh, that's definitely like a Reagan poke right there. Like the thing comes out the sky, and I didn't remember when I saw it this time that it was man-made. So when they said it, I was like, oh God, yeah, they're totally taking a piss, man. They're totally taking a piss at Reagan and what they did, and this idea that there needs to become these super big weapons happening, and they need to, develop them, not to only, because I do think not naming the Soviet Union, I think, is purposeful. I don't think because it's not like it would have been a bad thing. They wouldn't have been told not to. I think what they're trying to say is like the planet that this, or even the galaxy, it's like what Nick said, trying to create a new enemy, all right, of empire, which I think things like the X-Files in the 90s become so important because the world gets so chaotic and no one can really know what enemy is for empire. So they have to kind of constantly invent them. So this feels like a proto in many ways watching it. And I totally agree. Go ahead, Jay.
Well, one interesting thing is that so the original 58 film, it did have a sequel in 72, which is like a very long time between a single sequel, called the Beware the Blob or Son of the Blob. And I haven't seen. It'd be interesting to watch that film. But this one, they intended for there to be a sequel. So like, we could have had a movie, right, where that reverend, keeps the blob and unleashes it for his like apocalyptic rapture, whatever that he's trying to do. The Day of Reckoning is what he calls it at the end of the film. But apparently just because it wasn't very successful in the box office in the 80s, like that didn't end up ever materializing. And so that just interestingly, on that kind of point.
It totally felt like they were sequel baiting at the end of that. I was like, oh, okay. I was like, and I wanted to Google if a sequel was made. I was like, okay, cool, man. We're gonna see like the Reverend break out now he's gonna break out the glass, and the blob will come back to kind of make his apocalyptic thing. But to go to kind of back to like the nuclear fallout thing, like one of the things that like had always stayed in my brain was that like when the world would be irradiated from like nuclear, everything would kind of mush together. So like there's like this, like the kind of like decay and all that type of stuff. So the blob also becomes this like figurative imagination of like the kind of like what destruction happens under this, old civilization, or this destructive civilization is going to make everything kind of just glob and deteriorate and come in, and it stokes that fear, right? And you get to kind of, what's weird and existential about it is they get to like confront it. So like they get to actually fight what is actually unfightable. Like if nuclear bombs were to drop, we can't fight that. We're done, right? So it's like this quasi way that you could actually fight what's unfightable. And that's kind of what a movie does, right? That's what movies give it the opportunity to do, to kind of give you this kind of cathartic way to fight with what your fear is. And the blob represents all those fears. And I think what Nick is saying about to be able to project, this is where I think the political unconscious goes into, because I think there's a way that we all know, living under capitalism, what it does to us and kind of where our fears go. We just don't know how to articulate it, but we can articulate it that it's a blob and that this shit is coming at us and it's all consuming and we're just afraid of it. And if we just had power to kind of fight it and just a ice, right, or cold, or like this thing that gets it. But one thing too that I do love, because my first thought was, well, what happens when this shit melts? And then the brother was like, well, we got to get that thing in the thing before it melts. And I always love the kind of sage non-white person. You know, sometimes it's the indigenous, sometimes it's the black man, sometimes it's the Latino. You know, like sometimes it's the Indian, the South Asian. There's always the sage wisdom of the non-white. Like, hey, you got to put that shit in the freezer, though. And I just found it so funny because the brother, he's in the movie, and then you don't see him for the whole time, and then he comes back to let him know, like, hey, put that shit in the freezer.
Yeah, he's interesting because he's the mechanic, you know, and he's the one who helps out Flag when his bike isn't working, and just like lets him borrow, you know, this ratchet and socket set basically to fix his bike, right? So it's like even kind of in that sense of like, you know, he's a mechanic. He should be charging this dude for this, and he's worried that this guy might steal his socket set, right? But he's like, "All right, man, like just bring it back," you know. And so, yeah, he's like a bit character, but you know, has an important role and is probably one of the only genuinely good people in the whole film.
And they had to balance out that the other brother was just, you know, Obama proto, you know. But to that point, though, I have to say, I said this to Jay. There's also a thing you see happen in the 80s into the 90s, like black men in these positions of power who do these like pro-state things, right? Like him. Granted, Dyson in Terminator 2 is a bit different because once he discovers it, he tries to stop it. You know, or like you have what's his name in Terminator, the police chief. There's always like black people positioned in these interesting places. James Earl Jones's many characters that he ended up playing becoming really pro-state people. I think of like the Hunt for Red October, Clear and Present Danger. I mean, they position him to be the most patriotic of them all. Like he's like super patriot in those movies, right? And it's like, I guess that's where Obama, you know, when he needed to get the battery in his back, he would just go watch, you know, James Earl Jones in those movies and be like, yeah, America, fuck yeah.
Morgan Freeman's trajectory too, like very much, you know, he ends up being president in movies.
Denzel too. All the military men Denzel ended up playing. I mean, I wrote in a piece once that more than half of Denzel's films, he has played a military person or a cop.
Yeah, the question of patriotism actually came to my mind when in the end scene when the Blob, you have one of those military medical guys or whatever in the suits, and they all have like grenades strapped to their chests, and I was like, what are they gonna do with these grenades, you know? And then when he's like, the Blob comes, he pulls the pins, like he's like does a suicide bomber thing where he pulls the pins. He's like, I'm gonna blow myself up, like America. And I was just sitting there thinking, I was like, nobody has that much patriotism, like nobody, even in the 80s. I don't think you'd see
one. No one.
I don't think you could see it.
Definitely not a black person. You know? Maybe Condoleezza Rice. I don't know.
Awesome. Is there anything else from this film that you all really wanted to like? Nick, did you have any other things you wanted to talk about, or was there any other like final thoughts?
Nah, I just really like the film, and I you know, I'm a big horror fan. Just for what it says about you know, the sort of zeitgeist of the time, right? And seeing the evolution of horror over time, like what changes, what doesn't. But I think this was not a scary film to me, and I don't remember being scared by it as a kid. It's more of like an interesting film of like, you're kind of like, what is it like? And I liked Mutume's sort of assessment of like what science is capable of creating but incapable of containing. And you actually do sort of the characters need sort of this religious explanation of this kind of really large, you know, super object that can keep growing and growing and growing. But I also sometimes think we need a sort of not a religious, but a sort of divine explanation for some of these things, because otherwise, how are they explainable? You know, and I think that's that's what kind of is funny about horror is it sort of taps into that. You know, like we went to a haunted house like last weekend, and it's like, you know, all of that stuff is like fake. These are actors. These people probably aren't getting paid well to do what they do. Some of them are really good, at what they do. But then why is it that we go to these things, and why is it that we we watch these shows, and part of it's like there's kind of a presentness to it, right? It does make you think. You're engaged in a way where I think part of your brain turns off when you watch like a rom-com or something like that. You're not looking at it the same way you would as like this film. I mean, obviously we were watching it to be critical and to kind of find insights, but I think it also just turns on a side of your brain that I think is subversive, because these films are not supposed to be like mainstream films. They're just kind of like pulp, there's things that are pumped out. But I think there's a lot more you can do in this genre, especially at this time, that really kind of speaks to maybe it's not an explicit conscious critique, but it definitely is a subconscious critique. And this film was actually really fun to watch. I fell asleep like twice watching it, not because it was boring. It's just because I don't have time at the end of the day, and I'm like, I'm gonna like try to squeeze this in. So I ended up watching this over breakfast. And I'm sitting there eating, watching some guy's like arm go into the drain and then exploding blood everywhere. Not the best thing to watch, but it was I really enjoyed this film, and there's a lot to do with, there's a lot you could do with this film in terms of kind of leveraging a critique. And I hope you guys move into the 90s. There's so many good 90s films. Actually, I think the 90s were worse than the 80s. There's a lot of like the whole festival culture that exploded with music, mainstream music just got really, really awful. I think films got really, really awful as well. But I think the 80s, I always have this kind of like nostalgic feeling about the 80s. And then when I go back and watch the culture and consume the culture of that time period, I'm like, wow, this is really messed up.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the genre films of the 80s are better. I think as the decades go on, the genre films get really, really bad, especially as they get more agreeable with corporate America, right? And then this is kind of what we get. I do have like two like things I wanted to throw in there that I thought was interesting about the film. One thing about the end, the film's construction was the kind of way it would not give you the emotional payoff of like relationships. So they have this scene where the sheriff goes into the restaurant, he's flirting with the lady who does she I don't know if she works the restaurant, I don't know if she owns it or runs it, but she's like kind of like the person who's basically like keeping it together at a high level. So you're always assuming that at some point you're going to get this payoff of like maybe they'll kiss or they'll fall in love, right? You don't even get that. The next time you see her, she dies, right? Like the movie does that, and it's pretty grueling. Like it's emotionally grueling. They set you up for this kind of emotional connections that they're gonna be like, nope, she's dead, right? I mean, they kill a 12-year-old. Like they totally like a 12-year-old boy just get ate up, and horror movies avoid that. Like the little kid gets away some weird kind of way, right? In movies, or like is the more powerful one in like one of the Jason movies. He has like when it's Corey Feldman, right? When he's really little, he can defeat him, but they totally resist that in this. They're like, oh no, little kids are gonna die, and the woman you think is gonna get at least some solace of love, or the football player. You're emotionally set up to really almost think he's going to be the hero of the film, and he's gone in the first 20 minutes. Done, finished, right? And the biker, he gets to be the one. Which I will say, I mean, kind of the points I think that already been brought up. I do think there is this fundamental love of like what would be like known as like the Bender character in the Breakfast Club. That kind of person. I think for a certain lot of filmmakers, the kind of James Dean going into the 80s will always be One-Eyed Jacks, will always be the kind of one that they think is like the true hero, at times, right? Of course, they have a very reductive read of who that person is, and they're still a white person. And interesting to watch Kevin Dillon as a lead, just very interesting. right? Because he's such an interestingly weird, like not. I mean, neither is his brother. They don't have a lot of range, so it's interesting to see like the range that they go for. But it is an interesting kind of phenomena of these kinds of movies. Of who they pick as the hero, and I think it always kind of shows the unconscious of the director, because it ends up becoming like a kind of fight, I think, between certain sections of like white people of who is the real hero of our culture, right? And you see them put different hats. Who is the one that we should be empathizing with? Is it Charlie Sheen in one movie, or is it Kevin Dillon in another?
Yeah, I actually think back to kind of Nick's point about settler colonialism, or and also about imperialism, that there is a kind of, I don't know how conscious it is among white folks, but like this idea that we're gonna need this transgressive figure, like this guy who's like willing to operate outside of the boundaries of legality and like what we think, the kind of suburban, you know, um, civil liberal, right? Whatever. And that I think that kind of bad boy, that anti-hero character, and the redemption arc of that character, and it especially as I think that's why also those characters are usually white, because even though in some ways I think he's standing in for a person of color, but like he sort of has to be white in order to be redeemed for, himself being this kind of like criminal, non-conformist element.
He's spicy white.
That's right.
Tabasco.
Yeah.
Hot sauce.
No, not Hillary, right?
Oh God, I forgot about that. Damn, you brought that one back to my brain. Oh gosh. No, we're not going to go there. I'm gonna leave that one alone.
Right on. Nick, thank you for doing this. Thanks for recommending the movie. I'm glad we had you on Halloween too. It's it's good to know you're also a fellow horror film, because there's a lot of horror films in the 80s, and so we're going to be doing some others that are not during Halloween. I'll make sure to hit you up and see if you want to join us for some more of those. And make sure check out Pod Capital, on Nick's Substack. Of course, support the Red Nation podcast as well. Anything else, Nick?
Halloween is not a holiday, it's a way of life.
Oh man, I should have had this up or something as you said that. And we didn't even get into a candy corn debate, which I thought we might.
God,
today,
I was going to bring that up, but I decided not to, because like we went to, so I'll let you all go, but like my daughter's like young enough to not really care. She loves Halloween, but like she doesn't get it yet. At some point she's gonna be like, yeah, this is you're insane, Dad, like whatever. But we went to the trunk or treat, which they just park cars and give candy out at the Native Community Center, and no candy corn to be seen. So it was a good Halloween so far.
Good job, folks, because we don't need that in the world.
Yeah,
right.
Yes.
The candy
you're off the island. You're done.
Candy corn is the blob, right? Like candy corn is the blob.
Yeah, totally. It'll come out your chest. It'll be like
it goes down like the blob, comes out like the blob.
God. It congeals your organs together as you consume it.
I mean, sure.
All right.
Yeah.
So on Monday, we have a quick turnaround, folks.
Yeah.
We're switching back to Mondays, and should be on Mondays, like going forward. So we are doing Empire of the Sun, which is another horrible Steven Spielberg movie. And we have Charles Zhu from the Chow Collective coming on to talk about that film, which is another one of these like Europeans in Asia, kind of genre, which is just a horrible genre of films.
Yeah.
And I'm really selling it. You don't have to. Let me just say this: you don't have to watch it. You can just come and listen to us talk shit about it.
But I think a lot of people have seen it if they're our age. I watched it a ton as a kid. It was on a
Why?
lot. I think it was on cable a lot. It was
definitely
yeah, and I saw it a
yeah.
ton as a kid. I think, you know, the epicness of it, planes. I had a plane fascination. That's why too, when I was a kid.
So anyways, it'll be a good one to debunk a lot of the stuff going on in it, because it's a China film, it's a Japan film, it's a World War II film, right? And but it centers around Christian Bale as a little kid, right? Which
A
is
little
just
British kid.
little British kid. That's right. Is he British in real life? He is, right?
Yeah, he is. He's got an accent.
Yeah. All right. All right. Thanks, everybody. This was great. Nick, appreciate you. And hopefully we'll see folks on Monday for Empire of the Sun.